Hey there folks, today I'm going to show you how to do a service on your OneUp rear hub. First, remove the end caps by hand, clean them, and set them aside. They are specific to their respective sides, so please take note for reassembly. Holding the wheel flat with the non-drive side down, remove the Freehub body by hand. Clean it and set it aside. You can now remove the springs, spacer, and ratchets by hand. Both ratchets will come up when you pull on the black spacer. Clean them and set them aside. Note the order of all these parts for reassembly. Flip the wheel over and using your Freehub tool, unthread the lock ring, clean it, and set it aside. Now you can place the wheel onto the base, non-drive side down. Place the axle drift into the drive side axle. Using your hammer against the axle drift, punch the non-drive side bearing out of the hub shell. Remember to do this slowly and ensure the axle and bearing are exiting the hub as straight as possible. Remove the non-drive side bearing from the axle and recycle it. Take the axle and push it through the drive side bearing until the lip of the axle bottoms out on the inner race of the bearing. Place the axle drift into the end of the axle. Keeping the axle centered and straight, punch the drive side bearing out of the hub shell with your hammer. Now that both bearings are removed, go ahead and thoroughly clean the inside of the hub shell. It's important to note that both bearings will push out through the non-drive side. Flip the wheel over so the drive side is down. Apply a thin layer of grease to the bearing seats within the hub shell. Flip the wheel over on the base so the drive side is down. You will then set the drive side bearing first. Apply a thin layer of grease to the bearing and place the bearing into the non-drive side of the hub. Ensure that the gray seal side of the bearing is facing towards the drive side of the hub. Place the guide into the non-drive side of the hub. Then place the bearing drift into that guide on top of the bearing. You can now slide the axle into the bearing drift. Keeping the axle and bearing centered, hammer the bearing past the drive side bearing seat, then hammer it into the drive side bearing seat. Check that the bearing is straight and fully seated against the ratchet interface on the drive side. With the drive side arrow on the axle pointing down towards the drive side of the hub shell, slide the axle into the hub and through the drive side bearing until the non-drive side bearing is sitting in the hub shell. Ensure the gray seal is facing up so that it's exposed once the bearing is installed. place the guide and the bearing drift into the hub shell and on top of the bearing. Hammer the top of the bearing drift until the bearing seats fully onto the axle and into the hub. Using your cassette tool, tighten the lock ring to 10 Newton meters. At this point, we recommend checking the rotation of the axle. If it feels stiff, give the axle ends a light tap with the hammer. This will correct the positioning of the bearing races and smooth out rotation. If the axle can pull side to side, you may need to check the bearing lock ring again. Lightly grease the outside of the non-drive side bearing and push the non-drive side end cap back onto the non-drive side axle. Apply a fresh layer of Freehub grease to your ratchets, the ratchet interfaces, the spacer, and the spring. The more grease you use, the quieter the hub will be when freewheeling. Ideally, everything within the Freehub assembly has a thin layer of grease on it. Slide the spacer onto the axle, then the ratchets, then the spring, and then the Freehub. Ensure they all mesh nicely together as you press it into place by hand. You can now also push the drive side end cap onto the axle. Congratulations, you've completed the OneUp rear hub service. If you're having any problems, please first double check that you've correctly completed all the steps. If you're still having trouble, please shoot us an email, support@oneupcomponents.com for help. A detailed description of the issue and photos are often helpful. Thanks.